life is short. There's this big, we kind of like, oh, when I retire or when I do X or when this gets done. And before you know it, something can happen. But the one thing I realized was that the stuff that I was stressing out over in life was not that much. Welcome to another episode of the podcast Survival Mode. And my name is Todd Angelucci, brain tumor survivor, PTSD survivor, registered nurse, and health and wellness coach. Here, chatting a little bit about survival mode. And I used to use that term all the time, like, hey, we're in survival mode. But it really, really came true for me when I was initially diagnosed with having a brain tumor. It was really out of nowhere. And I wasn't in quote unquote survival mode at the time, like I felt at the time of diagnosis. What I realized was that I was living my life in survival mode before. That was like my biggest takeaway from the whole thing. Like, I remember looking at my girlfriend and just looking at people and just saying, like, my life has to fundamentally be different. And the things that I thought were important weren't important, like work. Don't get me wrong, work's important. A vocation, purpose, meaning, giving back, all of that stuff. But I realized that at the end of the day, work is just work, and they would replace me. And the things that mattered were being there for people, the relationships. And I had a good friend ask me, like, really what goes through your mind when you get a diagnosis like this. And I was like, am I doing God's work? And honestly, I felt like I was. But one of the things that came true for me was that I could be doing more. And really is what I'm doing here on this planet, my purpose and meaning. All of that stuff had come true. But what I really realized was that I lived most of my life like I was surviving. And I didn't need to, if that makes sense. So I call that survival mode. And I remember after the diagnosis and going through the surgery, I told myself life had to be fundamentally different. And by the grace of God and all of the things, like my tumor, you got 99% of it out, very little residual. It's benign. It could grow back. There's a lot of question marks for sure. But I was able to go back to work. Part of me went back a little early. And it was really because I didn't want to sit around a lot, even though I live on a beautiful lake. I felt like I was getting back to some routine and just getting to things. But I quickly realized how easy it was to go back to the way it was. Like, okay, back to going to work, kind of grinding things out in the grind of life. And that's why I put the name survival mode, because I think, whether you had a brain tumor or PTSD, or you're just a normal person in life, we get caught up in so much of the day-to-day stress, all of those things that I find that we just live our lives like one stress after another. And I quote unquote call that survival mode. For the PTSD and trauma, people that have been through that, we live our life like we're in that trauma constantly. And having the brain tumor, like, opened my eyes to some earlier trauma that I had that allowed me, the brain tumor and the experience allowed me to realize how I was living my life. So that was the gift in it. And one of the things, like having the diagnosis and the surgery, it was a lot for sure. But there were some things that I feel it was there to serve me. And one of the things is that life is short. There's this big, we kind of like, oh, when I retire or when I do X or when this gets done. And before you know it, something can happen. And nobody ever knows. So one of the things that when I was creating this podcast, some of the ideas was, hey, stop living life in survival mode. And survival mode is, I call living my life like it's life or death, and it potentially is not. Like, okay, I gotta work like I'm poor, like even though I'm not poor, or I have to do X, Y, and Z, and if this doesn't get done, and it adds to this mental, emotional, and body stress. So that's kind of the thing. And when I thought about a name for the podcast, I'm like, survival mode, because it can mean so many things, that we are here surviving, and it could be true survival, right? That we have to be in that mode, or we're living life in survival mode when we don't really need to, or I didn't really need to. The other thing that I've learned in my own journey for, I didn't use the term PTSD for anything that I ever experienced in my life, but the symptoms and everything was there. It's funny, I've gone back to some counselors, and I said I have PTSD, but I never really embraced the PTSD diagnosis. And it gave me some relief because the symptoms made sense to how I was feeling. But I didn't live by this label and say, hey, I'm gonna like get caught up in this and use it as an excuse not to move forward or try to grow. So the flip side of getting through and the survival mode, and why a lot of PTSD survivors, or people that have been through trauma, or whatever label you want to use, or whatever condition, is the very fact that you want to survive, that survival instinct. Also, this is the dichotomy, gives the energy, the motivation, the determination to heal, to do what it takes to grow, to get those things and move past it. And it's that spark of energy, that determination, that really kind of helped me move past. And I researched so many modalities to help with the stuff that was going on in my brain way before brain tumor. My anxiety, my depression, this fear. I had debilitating anxiety. Like, I used to get panic attacks, agoraphobic, all that stuff. And I found some simple ways, and I unburdened some of that trauma and that energy, which I didn't know. Not that there's, everything that I share is purely educational. Do your own research, but feel free to reach out and ask questions. Early on, I took medication because it slowed the brain. It helped me feel better. But I met a counselor that does some really awesome work. And she wasn't a believer in medication, maybe of short term to slow the brain down, or very, very short term, but to really utilize our own resources, and to get through it. So I'm grateful for that, for sure. So getting back to survival mode, I think one of the biggest things to understand about it is that, when survival mode kind of kicks in, where you're living your life like your life or death when you don't have to, is really to just stop for a second, realize it, and breathe. The Navy SEALs do that box breathing. They inhale for 4, hold for 4, and exhale for 4. There's a lot to be done with breath work. Also, I love, and there's a lot of research on it, especially in PTSD, is about yoga. And it's kind of that learning to be in the body, and that body connection. People that have experienced trauma, there's this big disconnect from self, like even understanding it, recognizing, feeling your own body. So any kind of mindfulness practice is great. And sometimes you may need medication. I'm not the judge on that. Sometimes they're very, very helpful. But for my philosophy is like, hey, I want to work through this. I want to do it naturally, because I find that some of the side effects of the medications really cause me more challenges than anything. So survival mode, and understand sometimes that it's not like, imagine this, and this is what it was I've gotten, I had a diagnosis out of nowhere, like, hey, you got a marble-sized tumor in your head. I'm like, oh my God. Like, it was a gut punch for sure. But it stopped me dead in my tracks, where I met, like, oh my God, like, this sucks. Like anybody that has a diagnosis or anything that's traumatic or dramatic, or the C word, the cancer, anything, car accident, abuse, violence, all that stuff, it just changes things. And so, but the one thing I realized was that the stuff that I was stressing out over in life was not that important. It just wasn't. I was like, oh my God, like this isn't that important compared to what I'm dealing with. And that realization kind of opened my eyes. And that I encourage you to say, hey, in the whole scheme of things, is this that important? And of course, there's some importance to whatever we're focusing on, but it's that mindset, the mindset shift of like, what is this about? What is really going on here? Taking that breath and really moving through and understanding and recognizing. And it takes practice, just like anything else. But I think one of the things that, everyday people, myself included, is like we get caught up in this habitual. There's this part of this habitual like stress. We're in the holidays right now. This is November of 2021. We're in the midst of kind of post-COVID, but we're in the midst of COVID. And that in and of itself is a trauma mode, like a survival mode. Like it's trauma for all of us. When it first happened, there were shutdowns. It was just crazy. Whether I don't want to get political. There's a lot of political stuff going on around it, or medical, or anything like that. But there was a lot of reality, a lot of stress, a lot of tension, and there's trauma from that. And it's unblocked or unlocked some previous traumas people may have had and started that. But I remember living in survival mode during that, like, oh my God. And that was a true survival mode. And then letting the brain know, and sometimes it just doesn't know, to shut it off. And that is really the big thing here. So I named the podcast Survival Mode for the very reason of all things brain, brain health, brain trauma, anything, and which is basically the CPU of our body, right? Our brain is here to protect our body. So anyway, I hope this was helpful. Please subscribe, share this with somebody. If you have any questions, please send me a message on Facebook or wherever you see this, YouTube.